Okay, so we're recording. Okay, so welcome. Happy Wednesday afternoon. If you have been asked to come to this session, it's because you may have to invigilate exams this year, whether that be functional skills or essential digital skills, which are all exam based. We mainly do this to tick the correct boxes for our GCSEs, which is all overseen by an organisation called JCQ, but it does also apply to all of our functional skills and essential digital skills as well. But we've never previously done exam training, invigilator training for those, so we've recognised that actually it's helpful and that we should be treating all of our exams the same. So if you've never done exams before, you probably a lot of this you won't be familiar with, but hopefully if you have done exams, then all of this will just be a refresher. So on our agenda today is we're going to have a very quick look at our invigilation policy and arrangements, some information on starting exams, announcements at the beginning, any invigilation rules, invigilation for access arrangements, and assistants that might be using access arrangements. So that's people that have modifications or have readers or scribes and things like that. Late candidates, completing the attendance register, malpractice, finishing the exam, and any emergencies. Now, as I say, most of this is applied towards GCSEs. So I've tried to, where possible, put where it is for functional skills, but I might have missed some. So if anything doesn't make sense or if you're not sure, then just let me know. So our invigilation policy, as I said, everybody has to undergo training to be an invigilator. Invigilators, they do hold a key role in upholding the integrity of the assessment process. They are there to ensure that candidates are given an equal opportunity to participate in their exams and demonstrate their skills. But you're also there to ensure the security, integrity of the exams on behalf of SSG and the awarding bodies. So you have to make sure that you are preventing any malpractice or any administrative errors on our part. So invigilators, in order to do this, they have to be familiar with the instructions for conducting examination document that is called our ICE document. So this is given to us from JCQ. This is updated every year. So we always have to make sure that we've got the most recent version. And this should be, particularly in our GCSE exams, it should be there for you to look at if you need to. This is literally your Bible for exams. I have created a folder on SharePoint, which I will share with you afterwards, where all of these documents are being put so you can get to them if you need to. And that has got the ICE document in it. Just make sure when you're looking at the ICE document that it is the 22-23 version, because they always add and amend things. You also have to make sure that you're familiar with all of the posters that you need to use. So every time you do an exam, you have to put up the unauthorised items poster and the warning to candidates poster, whether that is with one candidate or 50. You must make sure those posters are outside of the exam room or close to the exam room, and that candidates have seen them and you showed them what it says on there. You have to make sure that you give all your attention to conducting the examination properly. So that doesn't mean that you can sit there and complete work or look at your phone or do emails. You have to be looking at the candidates and looking at the room, giving it your full attention. You have to be able to observe all of the candidates in the examination at all times. So that means obviously you can't leave the room, or you can't sit in a position where you can't see candidates, or they can't sit in a position where they can't see you. You have to be aware of any specific instructions relating to the subject that's being examined. So for GCSEs, for example, there's different requirements for maths and English, and different equipment that would be used, different timings. Essential digital skills is a new one for us, and there's quite a lot of different requirements there in terms of things they need access to. So you need to make sure, if you're asked to invigilate exam, that you've checked all that beforehand and that you've got all the right equipment. One last year that caught us was candidates needed tracing paper during the maths exam, and we weren't prepared for it. So we just need to make sure that we're looking at all of that in advance. You need to make sure that you know the identity of all of your candidates in the room. So if you are invigilating for an exam where they're not your candidates, which you should be, and we'll come to that later, you shouldn't invigilate your own candidates, then you do need to make sure that somebody has checked their identity, that they're, somebody who knows them can come in and verify that. And if there's nobody there who can't verify that they are showing you ID, because obviously anybody could come in and sit the exam for them. So for an example, if we say, there's a candidate in Hertfordshire who's doing their functional skills, so they want to be able to take their exam down there. One of our adult tutors might be asked to go to a job centre and meet them. They might not have ever met them before. So we need to make sure that somebody has identified them and can verify their identity. And you have to accurately complete the attendance register during the exam in line with any awarding body instructions, because that's an auditable document. You also need to make sure you're aware of any emergency procedures. So we have our procedures at the centre, which is where most of our exams are taken. But obviously, if you're taking it off-site, then you need to be aware of any emergency procedures on those in those centres as well. So make sure you check that before the exam, that you tell the candidates. Be aware of anyone with medical conditions, and inform either myself or Danny or Emma if you are suspicious about the security of the exams or any malpractice. We have to make the decision whether we report that to the awarding body or not. Most of the time, it's just something that we will log if it's not serious. But if it is deemed to be serious, then we do need to make sure that we've got an audit trail of that so that we can report it. As I said, you need to be making sure that you're giving your full attention to the room, which means that you'll be vigilant and aware of any emerging situations, whether that's malpractice or somebody feeling unwell, for example, and that anything like that does occur is reported, and there is an incident report form for you to complete. And again, that comes to one of the three of us, me as exams officer, and Emma and Danny, who are head of centre currently, and we make the decision on what to do with that. And then same with the case of emergencies, that you're aware of any evacuation procedures as well. So invigilators must not carry out any other task in the exam room, as I've said. You mustn't leave candidates unattended. You must not read the question paper, which I think a lot of people don't realise. They, as they've got nothing else to do for an hour and a half, they might sit and read the question paper. We're not allowed to do that. Don't know why. You mustn't use any electronic devices such as your laptop or a phone in the room. There shouldn't really be any of that in the room with you. I'll come on and onto it in a minute about why you'd have a phone there, but really you shouldn't have access to anything like that in the examination room. You shouldn't have conversations unrelated to the exam. So say there's two of you invigilating, there shouldn't be conversations happening between you. And you shouldn't help students or support them in any way that's not stipulated in the guidelines or as part of an access arrangement. And we'll cover that again shortly. So a vigilator, as I said, they shouldn't really have a mobile phone. The only reason they would have one is if they needed it to summon help without leaving the exam room. Wherever possible, I know in the centre we have radios, so they should be used, and phones should be left out. But obviously, if you are off-site and you're in a job centre or somewhere else, you might have to use your phone. Just make sure that it's in your pocket and it's not out visible, but you've got it if you need it. Obviously, make sure it's on silent mode as well. And as I've already said, you must make sure that you do not take any other items to the exam, such as a book or work to complete. You do need to make sure that you're giving your full attention to the exam at all times. You should ensure that all belongings and bags are out of reach of the candidates, and that any access to them is monitored. So wherever possible, they don't take them into the exam room with them. It's best if they're left outside, if they're given an area to leave them. But if they do need to be in the room, that they are on the other side of the room and it's well away from candidates. so that they can't access those. You do need to make sure before they go in that you are asking them, have you removed everything from your pockets? Have you got any of those items on you? And that they're put into their bags. So they're the posters that we need to be displaying for all our exams. So you've got your warning to candidates poster and the unauthorized items poster. And as you'll see on there, quite small, but no electronic items, and that does include watches. It used to be just like Apple watches, but they've now included it to be any watch, because there's just a lot of watches now that can do special things. So now it's all watches need to be removed, all phones, iPads, iPods, all electronic items. So you need to make sure you go through with the candidates before they enter the room, make them double check to make sure they haven't got any of those items on them. So a couple of other items that they can or can't take into the room. So they are allowed to take a drink in with them, but it must be in a clear drinking bottle, so it's had labels removed. And they can take a pencil case, but it must be transparent. It must not have any writing on it or things like that. And it should only have items in there that they need for the exam. And for maths papers, obviously they can take a calculator for a calculator paper, not a non-calculator paper, but all the lids and the cases need to be removed. And again, you just need to check that they haven't got anything written on there, any formulas or anything like that. Seating arrangements, so this should apply to all exams, not just GCSE, for functional skills as well, but it isn't always possible because of the small spaces we're working in. So wherever possible, you should be making sure that they're at least 1.25 metres apart. As I say, for GCSE exams, that is a must. For functional skills, it is a well, we hope that we can do that, but it's not always possible. So functional skills, I wouldn't expect you to get out a tape measure, but for GCSEs, we do have to. You must make sure that the seating arrangements prevent candidates from overlooking each other. So wherever possible, they're put onto separate tables. And particularly for GCSE exams where we have a number of them taking it at the same time, we do have to create a seating plan that shows the exact position of the candidates. And this includes anyone with access arrangements who we normally accommodate in a different room. Wherever possible, candidates should face in the same direction. Obviously, if they're looking at each other, they could be miming to each other, or they could be giving each other cues. So as much as possible, we shouldn't have them facing each other. And we need to make sure the area that they're given, the table that they're given, is big enough to hold all of the items that they need. So if they're doing an on-screen test for functional skills, you just need to make sure there's space for the computer, but also for them to do any rough workings out next to them. So for any written exams, that's GCSE or entry-level functional skills, you may need to make sure that you've got a clock in the room and visible to each candidate, so they know the timings of the exam. It must show the actual time as well. Flipboards, a flip chart or a board or a whiteboard where you can display the centre number, the subject title and the paper number, and then the actual starting and finishing times of each exam. For on-screen exams, they usually have a clock on them, which tells them how long they have left. So that's not necessarily a necessity, but you may wish to do it just so that you've got it visually for your own preference. But you might have candidates, if they're taking on-screen exams, they might be starting them at different times. So you'll have to make a judgment on that. So as soon as the preparation for the exams begin, no other activity can take place in that room. So basically, as soon as the test papers arrive in the room, that becomes an examination zone, which means people can't come in and out, and candidates can't come in until they're invited to come in. Once they come into the room, they are under exam conditions, so they need to be told this before they enter the exam. that it is a designated exam room, and that all of the rules of the exam now apply, which means no talking, etc. And it remains a designated exam room until all of the exam materials have left the room. As I said earlier, invigilators must establish the identity of all candidates in the room. So it may be a senior member of staff comes in and does that if you're not familiar with them. And when you're identifying the candidates, you complete the attendance register, which for GCSEs gets sent along with the exam papers. Once the exam has started, candidates may not ask any questions about the exam. In exceptional circumstances, they may seek the attention of the invigilator. So they might say they need to use the toilet or their pen isn't working. But if they ask you a specific question about the exam, we can't obviously answer that. So it's important that they understand that before they go into the exam. Invigilators should move around the room at regular intervals, obviously as quietly as possible, but an invigilator shouldn't just sit in the room to watch. They should go around and check and make sure that everything is as it should be. And if a candidate does wish to leave the room for any reason, so they need the toilet or they just need a moment to breathe, a breather, we can do that. But we do need to make sure that they are accompanied. The invigilator must stay in the room and another invigilator should go with them and remain with them at all times. Obviously, if they go into the toilet, you can't go into the toilet with them, but you do need to stand outside the door and then you then take them back into the exam. Obviously, you've already checked in advance that they haven't got anything on them, they haven't got anything in their pockets, so there shouldn't be any malpractice. But obviously, if they're in there a long time, you might question that as well. So for any written exams, the exam papers and the answer sheets, they must be collected in immediately at the end of the exam. So you ask candidates to just leave them on their table face down, and then you go and collect those. The invigilator should just double check that the candidates have written all of their correct information. A common one is they might write a nickname or a shortened name, for example, or they try and be funny and write a funny name. So we just need to make sure that they've written the correct name on there and that it's got the correct centre number and candidate number and things like that. And then what you do is you get your attendance register and you put them in order of the attendance register, and the attendance register goes on the top. For on-screen exams, invigilators must ensure that all candidates' work is uploaded and is saved before it's uploaded. So obviously make sure the computer's all completely shut down in the correct way before the candidate leaves. And if they have been using any scrap paper in any of the exams, then you just destroy that, you collect it in and you destroy it. So starting the exam, as I said, candidates are under formal exam conditions from the moment they enter the room until the moment that they are permitted to leave. They must not talk, they must not attempt to communicate or disturb anyone once they're in the exam room. Before they can start the exam, the invigilator needs to make sure that they are seated according to the seating plan. You need to tell the candidates that they now must follow the regulations of the exam. You ask candidates to check that they've been given the correct question paper and all of the information on there, so get them to have a look and make sure that that's correct. For GCSE exams, that would have all been written on the board beforehand, so they can do that. You ask them to read any instructions on the front of the paper, and what we've found is actually reading it out to them helps as well. You check that they have all the materials they need and all of the equipment that they need. You tell them about any notices that might be on the front of the paper, and you instruct them about any emergency procedures. And then invigilators must give the following information. So as I've said, they must hand in all of their unauthorised items, and they must be told that if they fail to do so, or if they're found to have them on them in the exam, then this could lead to them being disqualified. They have to write clearly and in black ink for any written exams. So again, make sure they've got the correct equipment before the exam, make sure they've got black pens and they've got pencils for any diagrams and stuff that they need to draw. They need to write their name, surname, centre number and candidate number, and then any information about the exam on the answer booklet and any additional sheets used. They should be told their candidate number before they do the exam, or it will be on their table for them. And then obviously fill in any other details as necessary. As I said, you need to go and check that before you before they leave as well. Make sure that they've completed all of that properly. Tell them to do all of their work, including any rough work, on examination stationery unless otherwise stated. So that is for GCSE exams. Obviously, any work they do could be looked at by the examiner. So if they've got the answer wrong, but there's some rough work in there to show that they've had some correct thoughts about it, they might get some marks. So they should do everything they can on the exam stationery. For on-screen exams, that doesn't exist. So they just have rough paper. And again, as I said earlier, that just gets chucked away. It doesn't contribute. Instruct them to write all their answers in the designated sections of the answer booklet and to cross through any rough work neatly. As I say, it could all count, so make sure it's still legible as it will go to the examiner. Announcements at the beginning of an exam. So the invigilator may read the question paper and the instructions on the front to the candidates. As I said, they must clearly announce to the candidates when they may complete their details on the answer booklet. So before the exams time starts, get them to write all their information on the front so that doesn't eat into exam time. Announce clearly to the candidates when they may begin to write their answers, and then the exam will formally start at that point. And so that's the start time of the exam, and that's when you would then note that on the board. Specify the time allowed for the papers. So what we found, it does normally tell you on a GCSE paper how long they should spend on each question, particularly for English. So it's good to tell them that and to advise them that. So you tell them the overall time that they've got for the exam, but you also say, we advise that you spend this long on this paper and this long on this section. Remind candidates they're not allowed to communicate in any way or ask for help. Only answer questions from candidates about the instructions on the front of the question paper. So as I said earlier, they can't ask you any questions about the actual exam, but they may have a question about the instructions on the front or a question about their equipment or something like that, which obviously you can answer. There is a suggested wording for Invigilator's document, which will be given to you. And last year we just used it and the invigilators just read from it at the beginning of the exam and it told them everything that they needed to know. So that was helpful. So rules of invigilation, the invigilators must not direct candidates to particular questions or particular sections of the question paper. So as I just said, it may say on the paper how long they should spend on each question, so that's fine to tell them. But then you can't then go and say, well, I think you should do that one first or that one first. That's not allowed. You can't make any comments about any of the questions, or if you think that there is an error, that's just something that you have to report to the awarding body afterwards. You can't give them any information about any mistakes. You can't comment on any of the questions, and you can't read any words printed on the paper for them other than the instructions on the front cover. And this is all for candidates who are taking normal exams. This isn't for anyone that's got any access arrangements. We'll cover that in a minute. You also can't rephrase any questions for candidates. So if they don't understand the question, unfortunately, you can't help them with that. And the same with any technical terms or subject-specific language. You also cannot give them any indication of the time elapsed or any remaining time, unless that you've got special arrangements to do that. I think the only thing you're allowed to tell them, and I think I do cover this later, but I think the only thing you're allowed to tell them is when they've got 5 minutes left, but you can't tell them, okay, you're halfway through. Obviously there should be a clock there. It should clearly say what time it starts and finishes. So unfortunately they have to work that out for themselves. So access arrangements, invigilators will be informed of those in advance, and they'll be told if they are going to be invigilating or acting as assistants. Normally, people who have got access arrangements are put into a different room so that they're all together. And normally you'd have assistants in a room, and then you'd have a roving invigilator who will go between rooms rather than just stay in the room where they had the access arrangements. The roving invigilator will enter the room at regular intervals, and they're observing the conduct of the exam, but they're also making sure that the assistants are following the rules as well, and people like readers and scribes aren't giving candidates too much information. And it's the centre's responsibility to ensure that all the candidates and the assistants cannot be overheard or distract other candidates, which is why we normally put them in a different room to the other candidates. Obviously, if you've got a lot of people with access arrangements in a room, it may disturb them if you've got assistants reading for them or scribing for them. So you do need to be conscious of that and make sure that candidates can't overhear each other, because obviously they could be getting the answers. So where a person is appointed to be an assistant or access arrangements, for us, we've only ever used readers and scribes, but they're the different things that are available. And sometimes it's just extra time as well. Where possible, a separate assistant should be used for each candidate. But sometimes if candidates only require occasional words or phrases to be read, so they only need a small amount of help, it may be that you do use one assistant for more than one candidate. You just need to agree beforehand how they're going to get your attention. So you might want a card, or they might just raise their hand, for example. But obviously you don't want them calling out and distracting others. So the assistant does need to make sure that they know in advance what it is that they're doing and what they can and can't do. So if you're asked to be an assistant, make sure that you ask those questions, and you need to be obviously aware what the special arrangement is, so whether you're reading for them or scribing for them. And then there's a cover sheet that the assistant has to complete, which is provided by the awarding body. This is for GCSE exams anyway, and that does need to be completed and included with the exam papers. So make sure that you've done that. So as I said, we normally only use readers and scribes an extra time, but we can ask for other reasonable adjustments such as supervised rest breaks, word processing, coloured overlays or enlarged papers, but that all has to be agreed by the awarding body well in advance. So if you're sitting there thinking that you know some candidates who would benefit from this, you need to be putting them forward quite soon, because I think that's January, that needs to be agreed. So if it is agreed, they can have a supervised rest break. The timing for their exam is paused and then restarted when they continue. So again, where possible, they'd probably be in a different room so they're not disturbing other candidates by leaving and coming back in. Obviously, they must not have access to the question paper or the answer booklet during the break, and they should be observed at all times, so they will need somebody with them. And the length of the break would normally be agreed in advance. So you know exactly what time they're going to be leaving the room, coming back in the room, and the exam will be finishing. If you act as a reader, then you're allowed to read the instructions and the questions to the candidates. You're not allowed to explain or clarify, so you literally can just read the questions word for word. You can't explain any vocabulary or any subject-specific words, for example. You also must not read any section in the question paper that actually assesses reading. that's quite difficult to explain unless you see the papers. But if they're judged on their actual ability to read, then obviously they have to do that themselves. And you must not advise which questions to do or in which order to do the questions, or to say, oh, I think you need to move on, you're running out of time, for example. So you may read numbers that are printed in figures, unless the question has actually asked for numbers to be written in words. And you may explain diagrams or graphs and tables, or decode symbols in maths if that's been agreed. It is recommended that you do have some knowledge of the subject, particularly for maths, because to be able to recode symbols and formula, you need to obviously have some knowledge of that. And you may give the spelling of a word if it appears on the paper. So if they're struggling with the spelling, but you've seen it in the paper, you've seen that word, you can direct them to that word so that they can copy it down. If it doesn't appear in the paper, then you can't give them help on that. So basically, you can't tell them the spelling, but you can say, look, it's in the paper. You may read back what the candidate has written if they request that you do that, but obviously you can't emphasise on any errors or pick out any errors. And as I said, you could work with more than one candidate at a time, but it isn't recommended just because it can be disruptive. But if they don't need you to read everything, then it might be fine to work with a couple of candidates at once. So a scribe, they write or dictate answers. Candidates dictated answers, I should say. They can draw maps and diagrams and graphs if necessary. But normally that's not. Normally it's more written. You must not give any factual help to the candidates or indicate if the answer is complete. So they have to direct you exactly what they want you to do, and you can't say, that's not done. Can you give me some more information, for example? Again, you must not advise which questions to do, which orders to do them in, or when to move on. You may read the answers back if they ask you to. And the difficult thing about being a scribe is about knowing when you should and shouldn't help them with spellings and punctuation. So what I would say is if it's a subject specific term or more advanced term, or if it's a written paper and they're being judged on their grammar and punctuation, then you should be asking them to clarify where the grammar and punctuation should go. You should be asking them to spell any words you think are a bit harder, or anything that doesn't appear in the paper. So it really is the discretion of the scribe. And again, you need to have some subject specific knowledge in order to do that, really. So for GCSE exams, there are specific policies relating to late candidates. So they are allowed to enter the room and sit the examination, but it is at the discretion of the centre. So it would obviously depend how late they were, but if they were 15-20 minutes late, half an hour late, then normally we would let them sit the exam. And they do then have to be given the full time for the exam, so they'd have their own timings written on the board. A candidate be considered very late if they arrive more than 1 hour after the published starting time. So the published starting time for GCSEs is 9 o'clock in the morning, or I think it's 1 o'clock in the afternoon. So if they arrive at 10 o'clock, then that's considered very late, and that's when we may not let them sit the exam. If it was 10 o'clock on the dot, we might do, but if it was 5 past, they would have been given time to speak to somebody who had taken the exam and given them some direction. So that's when we would probably not let them do it. And any candidates arriving late should be seated to the door wherever possible so they don't disturb other candidates. So none of that applies to on-screen tests or entry-level tests, because they're specific to the candidate and they're changed each time. So they're given a time that they should take the exam. But there is some leeway there. So if they don't take it at that time, there's quite a big window for them to take it afterwards. So I wouldn't worry quite so much about doing this for functional skills. So you need to complete the attendance register. As I've said, make sure that you've checked identity and that you've clearly indicated who's there and who isn't there. If candidates are in the room that aren't on the register, you should put them on there, but that should never happen because that should have been identified in advance. Make sure you complete it before the end of the exam. And then as I say, you make sure that you're using that to check that the scripts have come in and that you put them in the order of the candidates on the register. So if a candidate is suspected of malpractice, the first thing you do is warn them that they could be removed from the exam if they continue, and that could lead to disqualification. Hopefully it won't go any further than that. A warning should be enough, but anyone that's been given a warning, that should be reported to the head of centre, so to Danny or Emma afterwards, so that they can log that. If you suspect that there's any malpractice, I would suggest that you call and ask for help and you get advice on that before you make any decisions anyway. If they are being disruptive, say you would warn them first before you'd remove them, but if it continues, then you would have to remove them from the room and then the exam would become void. They should obviously be told in advance what the possible penalties are for any malpractice in an exam. We've never had it to date, so touch wood, we won't have it. And say everything should be logged in the incident log as well. As I said, really you should call and ask for help because it should be the head of centre that makes the decision about whether they should be removed from the exam. Obviously, if you're taking functional skills, you're on your own, you might not be in that position. So that would be an occasion where you would be authorised to use your phone and to call and ask for assistance and ask what to do. Nearly there, nearly there. Finishing the exams, leaving the examination room. So as I said earlier, you're allowed to give them a 5-minute warning for the end of the exam, but that's the only time that you're allowed to tell them. At the end of the exam, you have to tell them that they must stop working immediately. And put all of their put their pen down, but they are still under exam conditions, so still no talking. Any candidates that arrive late or have been given extra time, they should be allowed to continue until the full working time has passed. But people are allowed to leave the room quietly. So candidates do finish early, which does quite often happen, as long as the hour has gone. So from the published start time, so if they started at 9, as long as an hour has gone, they are allowed to leave the room quietly while others continue. Check that all their information is correct, or remind them to check that all their information is correct and that everything has been included. And that again, that's all on the Invigilator's document, the suggested wording document. So if on-screen tests, once the candidate is finished, there's no reason for them to remain in the room. As I said earlier, just make sure everything has been uploaded properly. They don't just shut the computers down. And as I just said, they're allowed to leave for GCSE exams. They are allowed to leave an hour after the published start time, but not before. So if they're asking to leave at 9:45, then you have to keep them there for 15 minutes. They can leave temporarily. I can't speak. As I said, to go to the toilet, but they do need an invigilator with them, who would normally be the roving invigilator. And depending on how long they're gone for, it's the discretion of the centre on whether you allow them extra time or not. So if they just pop to the toilet and they're only gone for a couple of minutes, you wouldn't generally give them extra time. But if for some reason you have to give them a supervised rest break, we may decide to give them some extra time to complete the exam. Once candidates have left the room, they've handed in their paper, they're obviously not allowed back in the room. And as I said earlier, they must hand in all of their scripts and question papers and any other materials such as draft paper before they leave. All of the exam papers must not be removed from the exam until everybody has completed. So they remain in the room until everyone's completed the exam. And then somebody will come, normally exams officer such as me or head of centre, Emma or Danny, to come and get the exam papers and take them to the safe. So for on-screen tests, as I said, just make sure that the software has completely closed. You just need to make sure that you've collected all of the unused stationery and that you do not read or photocopy any of the exam documents. You must check that there is a script for every person on the register. You must check that the names match all the details on the register, put the scripts in order, check the candidates have used their correct centre number and candidate number, and as I say, then give the scripts to the person who is dispatching them to the audit body, which should be one of the three of us. So in emergencies, make sure that you're aware of the policy beforehand on evacuation and emergency procedures. But generally speaking, you would just stop the candidates from writing or typing, you'd collect the attendance register, and then evacuate the examination room, making sure you take the register with you, and then do what you would normally do in an emergency procedure by checking that everybody is there. All of the exam materials must stay in the room. Again, they're still under exam conditions, so they must not talk, they must leave the room in silence, and you must ensure that they're supervised closely while they're out of the examination room so they don't have time to discuss the exam. Make a note of the time of the disruption and how long it lasted, and then give them that time once you you go back in and once the exam resumes. If there's a problem with the room, you may consider moving to a different room or a different part of the building, just so that they can complete the exam. But obviously you just need to make sure that all the exam conditions that we've discussed previously apply, such as the seating arrangements and stuff like that. And obviously you do need to make a full report of the incident. Okay, last slide. So now I'm going to test you on your knowledge from what we've just discussed. So if you've got a piece of paper and a pen, you can write these down. I'm not going to check you individually for them, but I'll give you the opportunity to ask any questions if you need to. So number one, what does ICE stand for? Number two, what are the two posters that should be displayed outside the exam room and vigilators should be familiar with? What is the only reason for using a mobile phone in the exam room? Name 3 unauthorised items. For GCSE exams, what time must candidates stay under centre supervision until? A candidate puts up their hand and requests to go to the toilet. What does the invigilator do? A candidate on the autistic spectrum with reading difficulties is granted the use of a reader. She heard the words read out but cannot understand the question. She asks the reader to explain. What does the reader do? A candidate is being disruptive. What should the invigilator do? Okay, so we'll just run through the answers. So you can just mark them yourselves. Oh, that's very small, sorry. Okay, so what does ICE stand for? That stands for Instructions for Conducting Examinations. What are the two posters? That's the JCQ Warning to Candidates poster and the JCQ Unauthorised Items poster. The only reason for using a mobile phone in the exam room is to request assistance. Unauthorised items, so you've got watches, phones, MP3 players, pencil cases which are not transparent, any food, drink bottles which aren't clear, or calculators with lids or cases. For GCSE exams, what time must candidates stay under exams supervision? So that's an hour after the published start time. So for morning exams, which most of ours are, I think all of ours are actually, that would be until 10 o'clock in the morning. If a candidate puts up their hand and requests to go to the toilet, the invigilator must call for help. And then the roving invigilator accompanies them to the toilet. And then the candidates remaining in the exam room must continue to be invigilated by the main invigilator. A candidate on the autistic spectrum with reading difficulties asks for you to clarify a question. The reader can read the question again, but cannot offer any explanation. They are only permitted to read and not explain. And if a candidate is being disruptive, in the first instance, you would warn them that they may be removed from the exam room, and that what the consequences of that would be. If they continue to disrupt, then you would call for assistance, normally from the head of centre if they're available, who has the authority to remove them from the exam room. And all instances of malpractice must be logged. So if there's any of those that you didn't get right or you're not sure about, then make sure you're asking questions. You can come and ask me, or I'm going to be sending these slides so that you've got them. That is about it. I need to now breathe. Are there any questions? No? If you are here, but I can't see your name on the screen because you're with another person, could you just let me know in the chat, or just shout out that you're here, because I need to log it on the attendance register. And if I can't see you, obviously I won't know that you were here. But apart from that, thank you very much for your time. And I will send out the slides, and I'll send out the location of all the exam documents.
Perfect. Thank you very, very much, Jen.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Thanks a lot. Cheers.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.